Have you ever wondered what it's like to love someone and never be allowed to say their name? In Hollywood's golden age, charm and scandal went hand in hand, but so did secrets. These 10 gay actors lit up the screen while hiding affairs that could destroy everything. Some defied the rules, others stayed in the shadows, but all of them loved in secret. Which story will surprise you the most? Stick around, you won't believe what some of these legends risked for love. Our story begins with the man who made the first bold choice, to love a man and pay the price. William Haines wasn't just a silent film idol, he was a box office sensation. By the late 1920s, he was MGM's golden boy, charming audiences with his smirking confidence and all-American appeal. But off-screen, Haines was living a truth that few in Hollywood dared to whisper. He was unapologetically gay and deeply in love. His partner? A Navy veteran named Jimmy Shields, the man who would change the course of his life forever. While other actors hid behind studio-arranged dates and publicity stunts, Haines lived openly with Shields. They hosted Friends, traveled together, and though they never shouted it from the rooftops, they didn't pretend either. But Hollywood had rules, and being openly gay wasn't one of them. In 1933, MGM studio head Louis B. Mayer gave Haines an ultimatum: choose your career or your companion. Haines didn't flinch. He chose love. He walked away from a $3,000 a week contract, one of the highest salaries at the time, and left the industry that had once crowned him king. Most actors might have faded into obscurity, but Haines and Shields built a second life, together, as two of Hollywood's most sought-after interior designers, decorating homes for stars like Joan Crawford and Carole Lombard. Still, behind the lavish drapes and polished surfaces, their choice carried weight. They had to endure raids, whispers, even public beatings. Yet through it all, they never left each other's side. They lived together for nearly 50 years. When Haines died in 1973, Shields was so grief-stricken, he took his own life just a few months later. Joan Crawford once called theirs the happiest marriage in Hollywood. And maybe it was, not because it was easy, but because it was real. William Haines was the first to prove that being true to yourself might cost everything, but living a lie would cost even more. His legacy isn't just about bravery, it's about love that lasted in a world that never made space for it. If you were William Haines, would you have chosen love or kept the fame? Tell us in the comments. If William Haines chose love with the world watching, Dirk Bogarde chose love in absolute silence. To the world, Dirk Bogarde was the definition of refinement, the kind of man who lit up British cinema with quiet strength and careful grace. He was a war hero on screen, a gentleman off it, and a household name across Europe. But behind the polished image lay a secret so carefully guarded it was almost erased. Dirk Bogarde was gay, and for nearly 40 years, he shared his life, quietly, faithfully, with one man, his manager and lifelong companion, Anthony Forwood. They moved in together in the early 1950s, traveled, dined, built a life filled with books, gardens, art, and silence. Bogarde never once publicly acknowledged their relationship. Not in interviews, not in memoirs, not even in moments when journalists circled too close. And yet, their bond was undeniable to those who looked carefully. Forwood was always there. At premieres, hospital beds, country retreats, he was listed in documents not as partner, but as housemate, associate, or friend. That was the language gay men were forced to use back then. Words that hid more than they revealed, but kept love protected behind locked doors. Bogarde wasn't just protecting himself, he was protecting them. Homosexuality was criminalized in the United Kingdom until 1967, and even after legalization, public opinion was ruthless. Contracts included morality clauses. Tabloids thirsted for scandal. For a leading man, whose career depended on fantasies sold to female audiences, being outed meant exile. So Dirk made the hardest choice. He stayed invisible. And in doing so, he kept Forwood safe, at the cost of being fully seen himself. In a rare act of quiet defiance, Bogarde starred in Victim, 1961, the first British film to use the word homosexual and portray a gay man as a complex human figure. It was revolutionary and risky. Critics praised his courage, but Bogarde never discussed why he chose that role. Perhaps it was the closest he could come to telling the truth. Perhaps it was his way of saying, "I see you, even if the world never will." As Forwood's health declined in the 80s, Dirk devoted himself to his care, giving up film work to stay by his side. After Anthony's death in 1988, Dirk was never the same. He withdrew from public life, and when he passed away in 1999, he left behind no direct acknowledgement of the man he had loved for most of his life. But in the quiet spaces between the films, in the shadowed pages of letters never sent, their story survived. A love too deep for the world to destroy, and too quiet for it to ever fully know. He had the looks, the charm, the golden boy glow of 1950s Hollywood. Tab Hunter was every girl's dream, and every studio's moneymaker. But behind the cover photos and fan magazine spreads was a young man living a lie so tightly scripted, he sometimes forgot where the real him went. Born Arthur Gellion, Tab was molded by the studio system into a clean-cut, all-American leading man. He was paired with starlets like Natalie Wood for red carpet appearances and forced into romances that made headlines, but never happened. All the while, he was in love with men. One of his deepest relationships was with figure skater and actor Ronnie Robertson, a bond full of laughter, passion, and the ever-present fear of being found out. At the height of their connection, they couldn't even be seen walking too closely together in public. Every touch was a risk. Every glance, a gamble. But the walls around Tab began to crack in 1955 when Confidential magazine, notorious for outing stars, threatened to expose his sexuality. Warner Bros., desperate to protect its golden boy, scrambled. They orchestrated fake dates, released photos, crafted headlines to drown out the whispers. The public believed the fantasy. But Tab, he was drowning. The pressure of hiding, of pretending, began to crush his spirit. Even his career started to fade. Not because he wasn't talented, but because he couldn't keep selling the illusion. It wasn't until 2005, 5 decades later, that Tab finally told the world the truth. In his memoir, Tab Hunter Confidential, he wrote about his love for Ronnie, about his secret affair with Anthony Perkins, star of Psycho, about the years he spent hiding and the peace he found once he stopped running. In his final years, Tab lived openly with producer Alan Glaser, his partner of over 30 years, in quiet, genuine happiness. He proved that even after a lifetime of pretending, it's never too late to live your truth. If you had to live a lie to keep your career, would you? Or would you risk it all to be yourself? Let us know below. He was the man every woman wanted and every man wanted to be. With his chiseled jawline, deep voice, and effortless charm, Rock Hudson defined masculinity in 1950s Hollywood. He starred in sweeping romances, westerns, and comedies, always as the strong, silent leading man. But behind the scenes, he was hiding one of the industry's most tightly guarded secrets. Rock Hudson was gay, and he lived in constant fear that the world would find out. Studio executives at Universal knew and worked aggressively to protect his image. They arranged a marriage to secretary Phyllis Gates, a relationship that began and ended more like a contract than a romance. While gossip columns praised the happy couple, Rock was navigating a very different reality. He had affairs with multiple men, some short-lived, others meaningful. Among his lovers was actor Lee Garlington, who years later described their quiet evenings together, watching TV, lighting fires, laughing like a normal couple. Except they could never be seen in public. But it was his final relationship with younger partner Mark Christian that exposed the truth Rock had spent a lifetime hiding. In the early 1980s, after years of secrecy, Rock was diagnosed with AIDS, at a time when the disease was misunderstood, feared, and largely associated with shame. He kept it private as long as he could. But in 1985, his gaunt appearance at a press event in France stunned the world. Days later, the truth was out. Hollywood's most beloved leading man had AIDS. It was the revelation that changed everything. Rock Hudson became the first major celebrity to die from the disease. His death forced America and Hollywood to confront not only AIDS, but the cruelty of stigma and the cost of silence. Celebrities rallied. Funding for research surged. The public began to humanize the illness. But behind the headlines, there was heartbreak. Mark Christian sued Rock's estate, claiming he hadn't been told about the diagnosis while they were still physically intimate. The lawsuit ignited controversy, but also showed how little protection gay partners had in a system that never saw them as family. Rock Hudson didn't come out during his life, but in death, he told the truth the industry had buried for decades. His legacy isn't just in the films he left behind, but in the conversations he forced the world to start. They called him the face of a new kind of man. Montgomery Clift wasn't the rugged cowboy or the polished charmer. He was fragile, magnetic, and utterly human. With just one look, he could express longing, pain, love, often all at once. But behind those haunted eyes lived a man in constant battle, with the world, with himself, and with a love he wasn't allowed to name. Clift was part of a new wave of actors who brought raw emotion to the screen. But off-screen, he lived in carefully constructed shadows. He had multiple same-sex relationships, though none ever acknowledged publicly. One of his most significant early affairs was with Jerome Robbins, the famed Broadway choreographer, a romance said to be passionate but turbulent. Later, he was deeply connected to composer Ned Rorem, who wrote extensively in his diaries about their affair, describing Clift as emotionally intense, tender, and tortured. Actor Jack Larson, known for playing Jimmy Olsen in Adventures of Superman, also spoke about their romantic connection, calling Clift the great love that couldn't be public. These weren't one-night flings. They were layered, secretive, sometimes lifelong entanglements. Through it all, Elizabeth Taylor stood by him, not as a lover, but as a fierce ally. She covered for him, protected his secrets, and held his hand through pain few others ever saw. She knew about the men. She knew how much he yearned for love and how much shame he carried because of it. She once said, "Monty was the purest person I've ever known, and the loneliest." His relationships with men were always private, some out of necessity, others out of fear. But they were real, deep, and often heartbreaking. Then came the crash. In 1956, Clift's car smashed into a telephone pole just after leaving a dinner party at Taylor's home. His face was shattered. His spirit, too. He never fully recovered, physically or emotionally. The addictions grew worse, the performances more erratic, but behind the pills and the pain, he was still seeking what he never fully had, a love he could live with out loud. Montgomery Clift died in 1966 at just 45. No partner. No public goodbye. But those who loved him and those he loved in secret remembered not just a great actor, but a man who gave everything to his art because he couldn't give it to the world he lived in. Farley Granger never saw them pretending. He was handsome, magnetic, and rising fast in post-war Hollywood, especially after starring in Hitchcock's Rope and Strangers on a Train. Women adored him, men noticed him. And Farley? He was interested in both. He didn't wear labels, he didn't offer apologies, he just lived. While the studio tried to pair him off with actresses for headlines, Granger was busy living his truth behind the scenes. One of his first serious relationships was with composer Leonard Bernstein, a brilliant, chaotic romance filled with music, ego, and champagne. Granger once joked that dating Bernstein was like falling in love with a hurricane. Exciting, but occasionally furniture went flying. That's Farley. Honest, charming, just the right amount of snark. He also had a long, meaningful romance with playwright Arthur Laurents, who later wrote West Side Story. Their relationship wasn't perfect. Laurents was ambitious, Farley was playful, but it was real. They broke up after about a year, but remained friends for decades, proving that not all love stories end in flames. But the most enduring relationship of Farley's life was with Robert Calhoun, a television producer he met in the 1960s. They were together for over 30 years. No secret rendezvous, no beards or staged photo ops. Just two men, living a quiet, contented life, even as the world tried to catch up. In interviews later in life, Granger spoke freely about being bisexual and about loving men and women on his own terms. When asked if he ever regretted being so open, he laughed. Not once. The only thing I regret is not dancing more. Farley Granger didn't hide, he didn't lie, he didn't let the fear of scandal take away his joy. He showed that queer love could be lighthearted, long-lasting, and proudly lived, even in an industry built on illusions. And maybe that's the quiet revolution no one talks about. A man who didn't fight the system, just refused to follow its rules. Richard Chamberlain was once the most desired man on television, as Dr. Kildare in the 1960s, and later as the smoldering priest in The Thornbirds. He was the dreamboat of American living rooms. But while women across the country swooned, Chamberlain was holding a secret so heavy, it almost crushed him. He was gay, and he knew it early. But unlike others who pushed back, Richard pulled inward. He built a flawless public image, gentle, intelligent, romantic, the perfect man. Behind closed doors, though, he was living a second life. One of his earliest known relationships was with actor Wesley Ure in the 1970s. A quiet, affectionate connection, but one that could never be seen. Later came Martin Rabbit, 20 years younger, who would become Chamberlain's partner for over 3 decades. They traveled the world together, lived in Hawaii, built a shared life filled with art, literature, and love, all while the world remained in the dark. Chamberlain even adopted Rabbit legally, not just for tax reasons, but because in that era it was the only way to offer some legal protection to someone gay men couldn't openly marry. But the fear never fully left. Chamberlain worried that if anyone knew, he'd lose everything. The roles, the respect, the career he'd worked decades to build. He watched others fall. So he smiled, gave charming interviews, posed for magazines, and stayed silent. It wasn't until 2003 at age 69 that Richard finally came out in his memoir Shattered Love. He admitted the truth, but also the cost of hiding it. The loneliness, the anxiety. The years spent lying to people who loved him, and the damage it did, not just to his public self, but to his own sense of worth. Even then, he didn't sound angry, just tired and honest. Richard Chamberlain's story isn't one of scandal, but of survival. He reminds us that not all closets are slammed shut. Some are gently closed and locked from within. Sir John Gielgud was theater royalty, a man whose voice could shake the rafters and whose Shakespearean performances became legend. But in 1953, his world collapsed with a single knock on a bathroom door. At age 49, at the height of his fame, Gielgud was arrested in London for importuning for immoral purposes. In plain words, soliciting sex from another man. It was a criminal offense in the United Kingdom at the time. The press went wild. Headlines called it a disgrace. Colleagues worried his career was over. But what happened next was almost unthinkable. Gielgud returned to the stage just days later and was met with a standing ovation. In that moment, something shifted. Not just for him, but for the entire conversation around homosexuality in British arts. Still, the shame cut deep. Gielgud was mortified. He referred to the scandal as the worst moment of my life and spent years trying to disappear from public scrutiny. But there was one light that never left him. Martin Hensler, his quiet, deeply devoted partner, 30 years his junior. They lived together in discreet harmony for decades. Hensler wasn't just a lover, he was Gielgud's anchor. The two traveled, kept house, cared for one another, all without fanfare or headlines. In letters, Gielgud wrote of Martin with warmth and protectiveness, though never quite daring to call it love outright. Even as society began to shift, Gielgud remained cautious. He never fully came out. Not in interviews, not in his books, but in private correspondence, his truth was clear, especially in one tender note discovered after his death in which he confessed, "What I fear most is not being able to hold his hand in public." Sir John Gielgud died in 2000, just after Martin passed away. They were buried close to one another, not as husbands, not as public lovers, but as two souls who chose a quiet kind of forever. And through it all, Gielgud proved something rare, that dignity can survive disgrace. Long before it was safe, long before it was legal, James Whale was openly gay, and not quietly. He lived his truth with a defiance that stunned even liberal Hollywood circles of the 1930s. As the director of horror classics like Frankenstein and the Invisible Man, Whale had earned the freedom to do what few others dared, be himself. But even courage has its limits, and love doesn't always save you. Whale's most enduring relationship was with David Lewis, a successful producer who became his partner, his muse, and his home. They lived together for over 20 years, not hidden behind fake marriages or staged photos, but together, openly, in their Hollywood Hills home. Whale would take David's hand at parties, invite him to set, laugh off the gossip. In private, they were known for throwing lavish salons where artists, actors, and queers gathered freely, rare oases of joy in a time of fear. But when the studio system shifted and Whale's creative freedom dried up, the cracks began to show. He withdrew from directing, his health declined, and in 1952 David left, not out of lack of love, but out of emotional exhaustion. The breakup shattered Whale in ways no monster ever could. He grew isolated, depressed, haunted by migraines and strokes that left him confused and in pain. Friends stopped visiting, the phone stopped ringing, and then, in 1957, James Whale drowned himself in his backyard pool. The note he left behind was simple, but devastating. The future is just old age and illness and pain. I must have peace. David Lewis initially tried to hide the suicide note, hoping to spare Whale's legacy. But in time, the truth came out, and with it, a portrait of a man who had lived fearlessly but died quietly. Whale's story was later immortalized in the film Gods and Monsters, a poetic reflection on love, loss, and the terrifying weight of memory. James Whale didn't die because he was gay, but he died in a world that still didn't know how to hold men like him, men who loved deeply, lived loudly, and carried wounds no one ever truly saw. He gave us monsters, but he was never one of them. Have you ever known someone who hid their pain behind brilliance? Let us know what the story meant to you. And finally, rounding out our list is a man whose story doesn't scream, it whispers. A man who walked away from everything most actors fight to have, simply to protect someone he loved. In the 1950s, George Nader was rising fast. Handsome, talented, poised to be the next matinee idol. The studios had plans, and so did he. But George carried a secret that didn't fit the script. He was gay. And while others hid, maneuvered, or played along with the system, George made a different choice. He told the truth by stepping away. When Confidential magazine threatened to outrock Hudson, Nader was placed in an impossible position. The magazine, working through their shared agent, targeted George as a diversion, a way to bury the bigger story. George knew what it meant. He knew what he was giving up. He let them publish. He let them twist it. And just like that, his film career vanished. But rock was safe, and George never once asked for thanks. He didn't hold press conferences. He didn't write tell-all books. He just disappeared quietly with dignity. But George didn't vanish into bitterness. He stepped into something richer. He moved to Europe with his lifelong partner, Mark Miller, a man who never once appeared on a studio lot but became the center of George's world. For over 50 years, they built a life in stillness. Books, travel, laughter, mornings that didn't require hiding. In private letters, George called Mark his compass, his calm, and his answer. He never needed a spotlight again, because what he had was real. No staged romances, no red carpets, just a love that asked nothing of the world except to be left alone. In the end, when George passed in 2002, he didn't leave behind unfinished roles or scandals. He left a man who had been loved wholly, and a quiet example of what it means to protect the people you love, even if no one will ever know it. Some heroes change the world with speeches. George Nader did it with silence, and a kind of loyalty this town rarely remembers. They loved in silence because the world wasn't ready to listen, but through every secret, every sacrifice, they left behind something powerful. truth. These weren't just actors. They were men who dared to love, even when it meant losing everything. If any of these stories moved you, share this video, talk about them, say their names. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe. We have more untold stories waiting, and you won't want to miss what Hollywood tried to hide.